This is the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast from Advanta IRA, where we show you how to explore investments beyond Wall Street and open your eyes to new options for your portfolio. It's time to take control and give yourself the freedom to choose where you invest your money.
Hi, welcome to another edition of the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. My name's Alex Perny. Today we'll be covering exactly how you can reduce fees and increase flexibility using self-directed IRA structures. But first, we'll get into the download. Right now, Apple is reporting its first wave of layoffs after kind of not following suit with the rest of the tech sector, laying off 100 recruiters that were in contract positions. So any of the full-time employees that did recruiting for Apple are still staying on. But this is kind of an interesting look at the world's most valuable company, as they have been kind of stalwarts with regard to being the ones that have always been continuing to hire talent and increase their their workforce, are actually slowing down. This is the first real show of a slowdown for them, and they do have over 150,000 employees, so it'll be interesting to see how that kind of affects the larger swath of the employees that they have, if they will actually start laying off more salaried employees or full-time employees. Right now is just being seen in the contractor section of their actual employment. So we'll see how that pans out. But this is following suit of Tesla, Microsoft, Amazon, and Oracle, who have already slowed down, or even some have actually frozen all of their hiring. So, of course, tech has been seeing just a absolute bloodbath of recent in this year. Of almost most of the companies are seeing at least a 24 to some of them a half of their original share price starting back in January of this year. Now, some better news coming out of the financial markets. Walmart and Home Depot both beat earnings projections with their most recent earning reports from Wall Street. Even as retail and housing markets are both seeing a sharp decline, both of them actually beating projections, which is absolutely fantastic. These reports help to generally bring markets higher this week. The NASDAQ and Dow Jones rose almost 1% each on this news of these earnings reports being better than expected from both Walmart and Home Depot. And another interesting one I did in research for this podcast is that Bed Bath & Beyond, strangely enough, has beat earnings expectations, and their share price rose to 26.46 per share, which is a 75% increase in their share price. So for those of you that are big BBB fans, it's definitely good news from that retailer to see that people are still buying home goods. So if you're interested in some things that are actually going well, Walmart, Home Depot, and Bed Bath & Beyond all showing some pretty good signs, even though there has been significant economic slowdown, especially with consumer goods and home goods alike. Now, some slightly less good news. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Barclays are all in hot water over an SEC investigation into the banks using encrypted messaging services such as WhatsApp to send correspondence regarding interest rate swap markets. Now, this is a very big deal, as there are very specific rules with regards to how banks communicate with each other, especially when it comes to things that put affect how markets function and how markets fluctuate. So the SEC has rules in place that these types of records need to be preserved and be readily available for review by the Security Exchange Commissions and FINRA alike. Now, these fines are expected to total over $2 billion. And it's really, really frightening is the fact that these banks are being accused of collusion into actually the interest rate swap markets, which has a direct effect on what end-use consumers for things like mortgages and interbank lending actually see as far as their pricing. So definitely frightening to see some of these kind of less than above board actions being taken by some of the nations and the world's largest banks. Now, JP Morgan has already paid a fine of $200 million this year in connection with this. And it's expected that, again, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, and a few other banks are going to come around and pony up the other $1.8 billion as these fines actually start coming out. The SEC is expected to start levying these fines in the next month or two. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how these play out and how it affects the share prices of these banks as well. Moving from banks into retirement accounts, Bloomberg is reporting that the retirement plan crisis in the United States is heating up significantly. Just this year, almost $3.1 trillion have been wiped out of retirement plan values to date. Now, as of the recording of this, it's mid-August, and that is absolutely terrifying. Now, of course, the United States retirement market has somewhere in the neighborhood of about $30 trillion worth of value presently. And, of course, that is starting to slide with reports like this, but it just kind of goes to underscore how important it is to have some diversity within your retirement plan portfolio. And this isn't just talking about having different sectors held within a retirement plan. When all of the assets are securities, when securities markets take a dip or there's investors are actually having some type of fright within the markets, it can affect all different sectors, not just the one that particularly is maybe getting hit from certain markets. For example, looking at technology, technology dragging down a huge portion of the market. Many of the large indexes being very heavy with technology sector companies can help to drag down other companies and other share prices as well. So while yes, maybe let's say you're invested in Microsoft and then also invested in something like, let's say, Home Depot, although Home Depot, according to their earnings reports, their share prices did rise. These types of things can help drag down a ship, and in this case, the ship being your retirement plan, if it is only holding one asset class, be in this case publicly traded securities. So getting out there and actually looking for true diversity can definitely help to alleviate some of this, but definitely pretty frightening to see that U.S. Retirement plans have lost so much value just in 2022, and especially coming on the heels of the Fed continuing to raise interest rates with another 75 basis point increase coming just last week, and obviously more rate increases are expected over the coming months. So again, for those out there that are looking for something to actually, maybe stop some of the hurt or maybe stymie the bleeding of your retirement plans, looking into truly alternative asset classes, like things like real estate, mortgages, and other types of more tangible assets are very important in times like today. In crypto news, we'll round out the download with crypto. We are seeing a significant increase in hacks this year. Chainalysis, a large cryptocurrency tracking service, is reporting that hackers have increased their frequency and sophistication, with presently in 2022, there have been around $1.9 billion in crypto assets lost to hackers. And this is up 58% from the same time last year. Now, this is mainly attributed to larger state players such as North Korea getting into the crypto hacking space, which helps to increase sophistication of the attacks and also the frequency at which they're done. Recently, we saw Tornado Cash, which was a service that helped to hide the transmission source of crypto to its end user, be shut down by the Department of Justice as they were cited for engaging in illegal and money laundering activities. But services like this that exist out there to help hide the source and the actual destination of cryptocurrency certainly aren't helping anything as well, which kind of brings up the point that I'd like most people to understand is that if you are going to invest in crypto, and I've said this in other podcasts, please do your research and understand exactly what you're investing in and how these things actually work. Cryptocurrency is immensely complex. There are certainly ways to invest in it which don't involve a high degree of sophistication, but you really need to understand how to protect yourself, how things like wallets work, how especially things like offline cold storage works, because these hackers are going after mainly things like hot wallets and exchanges and different places where people aren't protecting their assets to the degree that they should. Now, would this alleviate all of the pain that investors are seeing? Certainly not, especially when you have state players, again, people like North Korea coming into the mix, which have, the backing of governments and have, basically a blank check to develop and implement hacking schemes against different investors. But it's important to understand that if you're going to be invested in this type of area or in this space, that you understand how to protect yourself, because these things are only going to increase not only with frequency, but also sophistication. This has been The Download. Today on the What is EBITDA? especially with things such as earning reports and people paying a lot more close attention to share prices and what's going on in the markets. I think EBITDA is an interesting thing to actually look at because it might be put out there. You might read the acronym. So EBITDA, what is it? It's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, is an alternative measure of profitability to net income. By stripping out the non-cash depreciation and amortization expenses, as well as taxes and debt costs dependent on the capital structure, EBITDA attempts to represent cash profits generated by a company's operations. So basically, it's taking a more narrow look at just what the cash operations are of a company in relation to its actual profitability. EBITDA is not a metric recognized under the generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. Some public companies report EBITDA in their current quarterly results along with adjusted EBITDA figures, typically excluding additional costs such as stock-backed compensation. This is EBITDA, and this is the What Is. So today what I want to talk to people about are some of the advantages on how people can actually structure and maintain their assets within a self-directed IRA. Now, it's important to understand that a lot of people, when it comes to investing in alternative assets, might be a little bit new, or maybe they're not necessarily new to the asset class and they have a certain way that they like to operate things, but operating under a more traditional custodial type of an account might not necessarily be the best fit, or they would like an additional degree of flexibility, especially important if you're, let's say, doing something like auction purchases of property, or you want to buy tax liens or tax deeds, things like cryptocurrency. Especially true with maybe doing a rehab or a fix and flip with residential real estate, or maybe you just like to buy and hold a lot of assets and you just appreciate the ability to do things kind of on your own terms and your own schedule. So I want to kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive into what exactly checkbook control is. We've covered it a little bit on one of our previous podcasts with attorney John Heyer, and I've kind of touched on it a little bit with regards to the issues of self-storage of things like precious metals, but we haven't kind of really broken it down into what exactly checkbook control is, how you can establish it, and what some of the benefits and the drawbacks of this particular type of investment structure underneath of an IRA are. So today we're going to dig into that. So let's first understand what exactly a self-directed IRA is, because this is going to help you understand the difference on how this structure might differ from an account, let's say at Fidelity or Charles Schwab. If you were to go to them and say, hey, I'd like to form a new LLC and have my IRA own it, they're going to look at you like you're crazy and probably not return your phone call or return your email. So it's important to understand the type of an account that can actually hold this investment structure, so then you can understand maybe how this might fit into your investment portfolio or your investment strategy. So you need you need a vessel like a self-directed IRA in order to be able to do this. Self-directed IRAs give owners complete control over their retirement funds and investment decisions. So if you'd like to invest in something that is not on a traded securities market, which I think is an important avenue for a lot of people to look at, with how much value has been wiped off the securities markets, but again, $3.1 trillion of value in 2020 alone wiped out of securities markets. And this is especially important if you're dependent on cash flow from things like dividends, which are pegged directly to a securities price, in order to try to mitigate that or try to get away from that type of reliance on cash flow in order to be able to get into better cash flowing assets that aren't so price dependent. So self-directed IRAs give the investor that type of control to invest in alternatives which are going to have a less price dependent cash flow ratio to them. Things like real estate, mortgage notes, private placements, foreign currency, future tradings, and a lot of other types of options are available to people using these types of an account. Now, typically under a structure of self-directed IRAs, you have to deal directly with the custodian in order to actually make an investment. So you would call up your custodian and say, hey, I'd like to make an offer on this piece of real estate. They would help you through that process by signing contracts, reviewing closing documents. Now, this doesn't inherently add a whole lot of overhead, but it definitely is a little bit of an interaction and a learning process for people to go through. Now, if you're someone that likes to maybe sign a contract for a piece of real estate on off hours, or if you want to do something like cryptocurrency trading, things where you need a higher degree of flexibility and the ability to do things on your own time and schedule, or maybe with a little bit more of a quote point and click type functionality, checkbook control, or the ability to utilize some structure which offers you that, can be very important. Now, a lot of people haven't really heard of checkbook control, or if you've heard my podcast and listened to a few things, you might be a little bit confused on what exactly that is. So with self-directed IRAs gaining in popularity, the structure that a lot of people aren't necessarily as familiar with is checkbook control. This allows IRA clients to take greater control of their IRAs by establishing an LLC, or in some cases a trust, although that's definitely not as popular, for a conduit for the IRA funds. Now, these structures are very useful, but must be used correctly. So there is a lot of ways that people can kind of go amiss with this, and you need to understand kind of what responsibilities you're taking on and which ones you're giving up when it comes to saying, hey, I'm going to not use the more traditional custodial method, and I'd like to use checkbook control for my IRA, of what exactly the pros and cons are of that. Now, again, to get a little bit of a baseline, if you have almost any type of retirement plan, you can use self-direction, and you also can use checkbook control. You don't necessarily have to have a Roth IRA, which is something I hear a lot professionally, is that, hey, I'd like to do this, but I don't have a Roth IRA. You can use anything from a Roth IRA to a traditional IRA, SEP and simple IRAs, solo 401ks, covered L ESAs, and even HSAs in order to do self-direction and checkbook control. And even a little bit past that, not all of these types of accounts, namely the solo 401k, do you even have to have a second entity in order to gain that checkbook control. So again, it's important to understand that almost any type of retirement plan can be used in this type of investment structure. Now, why do people choose to checkbook control? You get more control of your assets. So instead of having to go to the custodian to actually process any investments, to make payments on something, to pay invoices, to actually buy or sell trade assets, you get to write the checks directly, and you get to use your own discretion outside of the custodian's purview to make those types of investment decisions. You also do have the potential for reduced fees. You can purchase multiple assets without increasing your cost basis to your custodian. So a lot of custodians will charge either a per asset fee or a value-based fee, depending on how you set up the account, and they'll typically always charge a processing fee for actually buying or selling something. Now, with a checkbook control account, since the IRA has invested into the conduit of this entity, all of the investment decisions and record keeping are done on the side of the client and not utilizing the custodian directly, which greatly helps to sometimes reduce fees. Now, let's say you're only wanting to purchase one piece of rental property, but let's say it's a rehab, and checkbook control would greatly help you with coordinating the rehab costs, paying contractors, doing things like that. While you may not necessarily reduce your fees, you might see benefits in other areas, such as the efficiency in which you can actually execute your investment discretion. So fees reduction is something that people look to a lot, but I tell people typically you're not going to save as many fees as you might think, especially when you have to do an LLC, because you're going to have to pay to have an operating agreement drafted, which is going to cost you some money, typically a couple $100s. And you're also going to have to pay a state registration fee annually to whatever state you register the LLC in. Now, the LLC does not have to be registered in the state that you live in, nor does it have to be registered in the state that the IRA custodian is doing business in, but states vary widely in how much they actually charge for you to have an LLC in that particular state. States here like Florida charge less than $200. I think it's around $150 a year. But some states like California are extremely expensive. You can see $600, $700, $800 per year in just the annual cost to have an LLC registered in that particular state. So you need to look at the cost savings holistically when it comes to how much you're actually going to save or potentially save, because you have some other costs to factor in on how much it's going to cost you to set up this type of structure for your IRA. So again, to bring it back to the points I'm trying to make, while fee reduction may be something that you're looking at, it may not always necessarily be as much of a factor in your decision making as you may think. So just keep in mind there are some additional fees that are going to be outside the scope of your custodian when doing checkbook control. And lastly, checkbook control offers significantly greater flexibility for the IRA client to actually engage in different investment structures, do things maybe a little bit quicker, and also maybe hold more assets, again, with less fees. So cryptocurrency being kind of one of the big ones we see right now. Cryptocurrency exchanges, for the most part, there's places like FTX, Cross Tower, IRAs that will allow an IRA to directly interface with their platform, but some of the larger ones, let's say like Gemini or Kraken or Binance, aren't going to necessarily allow an IRA to directly interface with them. So if you want to invest in cryptocurrency, using an LLC can open up a greater amount of avenues for you to invest in cryptocurrency, and also be able to do offline cold storage, which, again, going back to some of the dangers of large hacking attacks that are happening in the cryptocurrency market, might be a great benefit to you. So if you'd like to do something like cryptocurrency trading, we're seeing a lot of people kind of go that route when it comes to investing in cryptocurrency, when making the decision on how to do it by using checkbook control. So with a checkbook control type of an account, let's make sure we understand the actual functions of an IRA. Normally, you have the IRA custodian. They're going to administer and retain any uninvested cash, pay any bills at the direction of the client, and the administrator receives and deposits all income from those investments to the cash account as well. So you don't necessarily have access to directly write a check. You have to go to the custodian and say, hey, I'd like to invest in this, and then they walk you through the process of doing that. Now, with a checkbook control account, because you formed a new LLC that the IRA will be named as the 100% member of, the client personally obtains control of that checkbook as the manager of that LLC. So once the funds have been moved to the IRA and then from the IRA into the LLC, the client is the manager of that LLC, has control of that checkbook, hence the name of this type of investment structure being checkbook control IRA. The client is then able to issue payments directly out of that account, and then also record keep any investments and any type of other inflows or outflows of cash directly from that account. Now let's look at some of the pros and cons. Some of the pros of checkbook control are the quick access to IRA funds for things like auctions. Really popular kind of back when I first started my career for people that wanted to buy a lot of properties from REOs, so real estate owned on bankrolls of banks from foreclosures. This was greatly facilitated by using checkbook control because clients could then set up a bidder account with whatever auction site it was, interface the LLC that the IRA owned with that auction with that auction website, and then bid at their discretion and ultimately take title into the name of the LLC. So auctions work very well for this. Also, a big benefit to people that want to do things like tax deeds, tax certificates, that want to invest in, let's say, a brokerage underneath as part of their self-directed plan. You can have a securities brokerage underneath the IRA-owned LLC. Definitely seen people do that. Things like foreign exchange and especially cryptocurrency are all very popular for just their administrative benefit of using an IRA-owned checkbook control LLC. Now, you also can hold more IRA assets with lower fees. So, for example, if the custodian charges you about $300 a year for a single asset, that one LLC, being a single asset, could then in turn maybe hold 5 or 6 different assets underneath of its umbrella, but the custodian is only going to charge you for that one LLC in the account. You're also not going to pay transactional fees related to the buying and selling of assets. So let's say you bought Bitcoin, sold it all to Ethereum, and that was all done under a Kraken account. Let's say you then wanted to get out of Kraken, so you closed that account, took back in the fiat or the cryptocurrency tokens to your offline cold storage wallet, and then it wanted to interface with someone like Binance. You could then set everything up, trade your coins on Binance, and you wouldn't have to pay any type of additional administrative fee to your custodian in order to do that. And you also, by virtue of the fact that you're using a checkbook LLC, would be able to interface with these larger crypto exchange platforms, whereas the IRA could not do that directly. You also have some possibilities for additional asset protection and anonymity. So a good example being crypto, you could do offline cold storage with your IRA-owned LLC in order to protect those tokens offline, whereas doing it directly with the custodian, you might have to either keep it on a hot wallet with that particular exchange, or some custodians do offer the ability to do offline cold storage, but it's going to be greatly reduced on your velocity of which you can trade cryptocurrency tokens if you have to go to that administrator to get those tokens placed back on an exchange. So again, degrees of asset protection, and then also for things like anonymity, which is another concern of a lot of our clients. If you're buying things like real estate and you have a deed that's recorded in public record, the IRA vesting, so how the title of that property is titled, would include the client's name typically. So, for example, here at Advanta, it would be Advanta IRA for benefit of John Smith IRA as the owner of the property. If you're using a checkbook control LLC or trust, then the trust or the LLC is what's going to be directly on the public record with that particular county. So anonymity is definitely something that people take concern with, and in a degree, in an information age, being able to remain as anonymous as possible definitely has its appeals and interest to a lot of people. It's also a little bit easier to make investments with partners through checkbook control LLCs. With the use of an LLC, you could potentially sell some shares of the LLC to a non-disqualified third party. You could form a new LLC with several partners and have your checkbook control LLC plugged directly into that other LLC. Or again, you can do the similar kind of things with trust. So doing partnered investments, or let's say you wanted to bring in several partners from the very beginning, your IRA could invest initially into a multi-member LLC and go forward from there. So again, a lot of degrees of flexibility in how you do these things that are going to be a little bit different than how you might do them with a custodian directly. These are definitely some of the big benefits that a lot of people kind of gravitate towards when going the checkbook control LLC route. Now, it's not going to always be a big book of benefits. There definitely are some drawbacks to doing checkbook control within an IRA. And some people might see these as drawbacks. Some people might not see this as any problem. So because you're removing the IRA custodian from the picture of actually administering and record keeping the investments, you as a client are going to ultimately be responsible for that. So keeping accurate records of everything that goes into and out of that LLC, which again is by extension the IRA, is ultimately now your responsibility. So if you're going to be buying a piece of real estate, any and all expenses need to be record kept. You need to make sure that you're not paying anything personally. You're going to need to make sure that non-disqualified people are doing any work on that real estate. Conversely, if you're doing things like cryptocurrency trading, you're going to want to make sure that any and all hardware used for offline cold storage is strictly just used for your IRA-owned LLC, that you're not commingling any personal assets. Also, any deposits made to the LLC account can only come from the assets that are purchased with the initial capital contribution from the IRA, meaning whatever the money you took from your IRA and put into this LLC, the only thing that can come back in are returns on the investments from which that IRA-owned LLC made. So, for example, if you bought a piece of rental real estate and you owned a few personally, you need to make sure only the rental checks from the LLC that your IRA is associated with get deposited to that LLC's bank account. Conversely, you need to absolutely make sure no personal expenses get run through this LLC as well, because that can be seen as a disqualifying transaction and could potentially blow up your whole IRA. So the responsibility for compliance and record keeping is placed basically solely on the client if you go the checkbook control route. Now, if you're relatively good with keeping records, you can use QuickBooks with a modicum of proficiency. You're probably going to be okay. You know, it's important to understand the rules, and this is why I like to put this out there every once in a while, because, you know, a lot of people, especially if you're just getting into checkbook, especially if you're just getting into self-direction and you're interested in doing checkbook control, you need to have a very good understanding of IRA rules before getting into this. So that way, by virtue of that additional control you get, you don't accidentally commit a prohibited transaction, which leads into the additional con is you have a lack of oversight by the IRA administrator. Now, people like to think that, oh, using the IRA administrator custodian can be cumbersome and it takes extra time. Well, with that extra time comes a degree of security in the fact that the IRA custodian, who is probably going to have a lot more experience doing this than you, can have a little bit more of an expert set of eyes looking over something and be able to catch some things that maybe you didn't think were an issue, but definitely might be an issue for you there. It's also a little bit easier to gauge in prohibited transaction, and additional capital calls if you need to add more money into the LLC can be problematic if you have partners. Now, let me go back to the point of it being easier to engage in prohibited transactions and why that maybe slight addition of burden of having an IRA custodian review a transaction might be a good thing. So about 7 or 8 years ago, when I was actually working with clients directly, processing transactions, I had a client, and I tell this story pretty often, but I think it's a good illustration, that was buying a rental property in Auburn, Alabama. He had a daughter that was going to go to Auburn in the fall, and you'll see why that can be an issue. So we went through the closing process. His whole goal was to rent it to college kids. So we go through the closing process, buy the property, everything runs smoothly. A few months later, I think it was probably around this time, in that year, is around August, school starting. He sends over a lease, and we take a look at it because, again, the IRA owned the property directly. We had to review the lease and sign it. I noticed that one of the women on the lease had the same last name as the client. So I called him up and said, hey, let's call him John. Hey, John, what's up? Is this person with the same last name as you on the lease related to you? And sure enough, it was his daughter. Now, he wasn't trying to commit a prohibited transaction. He just didn't understand the rules that you can't have a disqualified person utilize or benefit from an IRA owned asset. And he was even charging a market fair rent. And I explained to him, said, hey, unfortunately, your daughter can't live there. You can certainly rent it out to all of her friends, but she can't use the property, which caused a little bit of a headache for him. But, eventually they got everything figured out. He rented it out to another group of college women and he was fine. But in that case, it was simply just his lack of understanding that would have potentially caused him a huge, huge issue with the IRS if he would have been caught for a prohibited transaction. Now, let's say he would have done that same transaction within the auspice of a checkbook control IRA. So we would have processed the investment into the LLC setup. Then he would have closed on the property. He would have gotten the lease in the name of the LLC. And then because we didn't have any oversight to the actual transaction, might have inadvertently had his daughter living in his IRA owned property, which would have been a prohibited transaction, which could have caused him a huge amount of issues. So while prohibited transactions sound big and scary, they're not necessarily something that is, as bad as buying like something illegal with an IRA, buying, just whatever thing that is not legal to own, buying that with an IRA. It's not so nefarious as that. There are some specific rules that people need to understand. And if you don't have a good basis of understanding these, you can cause yourself a lot of issues. So having that little bit of extra oversight from the IRA administrator, especially if you're not super familiar with the rules, can be a big benefit. And I encourage people, talk to your custodian, engage in some education. We put a lot on at Advanta IRA. It's all free. I always tell people, give me a call if you have any questions, and I can certainly walk you through the rules to make sure you understand what you're getting into if you want to take that responsibility on with yourself of doing checkbook control. Now, what are some of the pros and cons of doing things directly through the IRA? Well, again, it keeps you a little bit easier to be arm's length from IRA funds. You're less likely to engage in prohibited transactions, and you have the IRA custodian and administrator giving you clear records of all activity in your IRA. If you're someone who takes a receipt and immediately when it goes into your wallet or your purse, it might as well have been thrown in the trash, then maybe checkbook control is not the best fit for you. But if you're relatively good with keeping records, again, if you're have a modicum of competency with QuickBooks, you'll probably be okay. And then some of the cons with using the IRA custodian administrator directly, you do have the potential for higher fees, but you also get more service. And then you don't have the ability to write checks for immediate purchases or do kind of immediate trades. Now, let's understand some of the rules. So in that example with John buying the property in Auburn, Alabama, let's understand some of the rules as they relate to whom you can and can't deal with and some things that you can and cannot purchase within an IRA. So you can't deal with anyone directly up and down from you in your family tree. That's what's called a disqualified person. So you can't buy or sell anything from your mother, father, son, daughter, or spouse, and even going up into grandparents and great grandkids. You can't go directly basically up and down from yourself in your family tree. Now, what that means is you can't buy and sell things to them. So if your IRA owns a property, you can't rent it to one of those people. You can't sell it to one of those people. You also can't buy from one of those people as well. So if your dad had a rental property that you wanted to buy with your IRA, even if it was being done at a, let's say, a certified appraised value for that market, you can't do it. It's just off the table. I know it kind of stinks, but those are the rules of the people you can and can't deal with. You also can't directly deal with yourself. So if you owned a rental property, you couldn't sell it to your IRA. I actually had a question about that earlier on a webinar that I taught earlier today. Now, there's certain investments that you can't directly buy with an IRA. You can't buy a life insurance policy. You can't directly buy collectibles. So rare bottles of wine, antiques, stamps, things like that. And by extension, an IRA-owned LLC, again, just creates a different vessel for efficiency with the IRA. It doesn't change the rules of what you can purchase. So those kind of things are still within the realm of things you need to be concerned about when using checkbook control. So let's look at some of the rules regarding the LLC for checkbook control. You have to be manager managed. To be member managed would involve the IRA custodian having to sign everything for your LLC. So if you want to go through this and you're interested in setting it up, it needs to be a manager managed LLC. And typically it's a manager managed single member LLC, meaning that your IRA is the sole member and you don't really have to worry about anything else, your partners. And this is also a benefit because single member LLCs are seen as what's called a disregarded entity for federal tax reporting purposes. So you don't have to file a federal partnership return. Now, let's say you had multiple IRAs invested in the same checkbook control LLC. Even though everything is tax exempt and you may not have any taxable liabilities, if you have a multi-member LLC underneath the auspice of your IRA, you're probably going to still have to file a partnership return. So doing things with single member LLCs can definitely lighten your workload a little bit. So again, some of the rules has to be manager managed. You can include more than just an IRA, but ownership percentages are always going to be based on the initial capital contributions to the LLC. So if you have more than one owner, you can't change percentages if you have disqualified individuals involved. Now, I said you can't directly deal with disqualified individuals, but you can partner. That's kind of a whole other rabbit hole to get down. But understand that even though you can't buy and sell between disqualified individuals, you can partner with them on the beginning of a new deal, but you're going to have problems down the road if you need to, let's say, add more money into it. So let's say the husband has an IRA and the wife doesn't have an IRA where they want to put in personal funds into that, well, then it would be, some things to consider with that as far as how you would go forward if you ever needed to add more money in there. Or let's say your grandmother has an IRA and then you want to partner your IRA with them, you can do that. You can partner IRA and non-IRA funds between disqualified individuals, but those percentages can never change. And you're also going to need to be extra careful with the rules to make sure you're not getting any direct personal benefit from your IRA investment strategies. Additional capital, you're going to need to be familiar with Internal Revenue Section 4975 if you go checkbook control. I'll just kind of put that out there. I would encourage anyone that wants to go this route in this type of structure, read 4975. I know it's an internal revenue code. It can be a little bit dry. It's not going to be something as interesting as reading Harry Potter, but believe me, it's going to help save you and make you understand the rules a little bit better with regard to checkbook control type structures. Now, if you want a little bit more case law on this, I would encourage you to look up Swanson v. Commissioner, which was a case from back in 1996, which was kind of the original basis for this being a quote allowable investment structure. Also, the tax court memo of T.L. Ellis in 2013, I believe, is also a good one to read. And a more recent one, which was titled McNulty v. Commissioner, which had to specifically do with how you store and what type of access you have to tangible assets such as gold, is another important one to read as well. I also did a podcast several weeks ago on the issues with McNulty v. Commissioner, or the issues raised by McNulty v. Commissioner as it relates to precious metal investing. But it's also some good rules and guidelines to understand with regard to checkbook control investing in general. So let's understand some of the basics of forming a checkbook control LLC. So the first thing you need to do when it comes to forming an LLC is you need to file articles of organization. Essentially, once you pick the state that you want to have the LLC in, you need to register the LLC with that state. You need to list some very basic information of the LLC: address, manager name. You need to file this with them, and then that'll basically kind of set you up for operating within that state. Initial filing fees are going to vary. It's going to be anywhere from like $40 to $500. So again, going back to that cost saving interest that I mentioned earlier of why people like to do this, you need to make sure that if you're picking a state that might be more expensive, is it going to be cheaper for you to go with the custodian directly and not have to deal with a little bit more administrative overhead and then save a lot of money? What's more important to you, the access and availability and ease at which you can invest, or saving more money? Again, your mileage may vary and it's going to be a personal choice, but just keep in mind that initial filing fees vary by state. Most of the time you can do all of that online, but also by mail if you'd like to. The next step is you need to obtain a tax ID number. Listen, this is just for forming the checkbook LLC. So you need to obtain a tax ID number for the LLC. You can obtain one online by going to irs.gov. You can file by mail as well. You'll need the Social Security number of the LLC manager. So if this is you as the IRA owner, you're going to be the one applying for the tax ID. It's okay to provide your social security number in this instance. It's not going to tie back to you as far as a taxable situation, but you need to file the tax ID number application. They need to know who's filing it. And then that's going to tie back with the articles of organization. And then that's what's going to allow you to open up the bank account at a particular bank for that LLC. Now, past this, that's what you need to do basically in order to get the bank account open for the LLC. But you're going to need to provide an additional document to the IRA custodian, which is going to be the operating agreement of the LLC. Now, this is not something that is required by almost any state in order just to register an LLC. And if you've opened an LLC in a particular state before, you may not have ever done or needed to do a operating agreement. But the importance of the operating agreement in this instance is to show the IRA as the sole member of this new LLC. So that way the IRA custodian can say, okay, great. Now we have the documentation showing that the IRA is the sole member of this LLC, that it is manager managed, so that the IRA owner and manager of the LLC has the authority to write any checks, to sign any contracts, to do what it needs to actually do in order to operate. But importantly, it is kind of the original documentation that is going to detail the investment of the IRA, because the IRA in this case is investing into the newly issued membership of an LLC. Now, what needs to go into an operating agreement? I would highly encourage people to find someone to you that can actually do the operating agreement. Now, there certainly are services out there, LegalZoom, other online options, but with regard to doing an IRA, I always feel personally it's best to kind of have someone, with a pulse on the other end of the line, so that way they can answer some questions, make any tweaks. Let's say they if you go to an online service and they kind of use a general template and you check the wrong box and it became member managed. Well, if that needs to be changed, it's kind of hard to go back to an online service if you're not dealing with a living, breathing person to get small changes like that made. So while it may be a little bit more expensive to use an individual to draft an operating agreement, I think the benefits definitely outweigh the cons for maybe a difference of about $100 to be able to make sure something's done right. And especially if you have a question down the road or something needs to be changed, maybe a few years down the road, you have that kind of person, that direct interaction to go back to and get something fixed. Now, what needs to go into an operating agreement? Again, this is the document that you are providing the custodian in order to actually detail the investment. It needs to have an initial effective date. It needs to name the members, which in this case, the self-directed IRA, which the custodian administrator will provide to you. It's going to need to name the managers. It's going to need to describe the limited liability of the managers and members. It's going to need to determine how new members may be admitted to the LLC, how members can be removed from the LLC, outline any voting procedures, and also other various issues that come up in the operations of the entity, how the taxation of the LLC is going to be determined. Now, keep in mind that you aren't going to want to have the election of the LLC be taxed as an S corp, because an IRA can't own an S corp. So typically most people tax it as a pass through, or if you have a partnership, tax it as a pass through partnership. But specifically, you can't use S corp for your taxing election, and then it's going to need to be signed by all of the members and the manager. So once you've done this, it can also contain a few other things. Let me kind of back up. The operating agreement can also contain how the agreement can be terminated, how to address disagreements among members. Now, keep in mind, if it's a single member LLC, a lot of these things are going to be relatively boilerplate if you go to any type of service that provides operating agreement services. So again, this can all be kind of lumped into what they're putting in there. But if you wanted to take a stab at drafting one, I would preface this statement by saying, this is a legal document. Paying for someone with legal service and maybe insurance against errors and omissions and other things would be important, especially if you're putting all of your retirement funds into this vehicle. But some people like to do things themselves, and sometimes you maybe want to just maybe also double check the work that's being done. You also want to address things that these agreements can also contain, is how to address disagreements among members and managers, how to remove a manager, rights of first refusal, buy and sell agreements, the governing law that's going to govern the actual operations of the LLC, and potentially any arbitration clauses for disputes among members. Now, again, some of these things aren't going to necessarily apply if it is single member, because basically you're just going to be arguing with yourself. So do you necessarily need to detail how to settle an argument with yourself? Take that for what it's worth, but I really hope that doesn't kind of crop up with a issue that you that you need to have resolved. So now let's kind of bring this in for a landing and show how this stuff actually works. So if you want to fund a checkbook control LLC, what are the actual steps in order to do that? So we've covered the different parts of the LLC, having articles drafted, having a tax ID application done, opening the bank account in the name of the LLC, providing your custodian with a copy of the operating agreement. But what does this look like from start to finish? So if you're someone that wants to use checkbook control and you think this is a good fit, the first thing you need to do if you don't have a self-directed IRA is open one up with your custodian. Shameless plug for Advanta. We do this service and we'd love to be of service to you. But so for example, in this case, you open up an account. Then you would need to transfer money from your existing custodian into your new self-directed IRA, which again, we can help you with and make sure everything is done correctly. At that point, then you can start working on your operating agreement. You can also start working on having the articles done, having the tax ID application done. You pick the name of the LLC that you want to use. You can then provide whoever's drafting the operating agreement with the name of the IRA as member. The IRA member needs to be specifically titled. So it'd be, for example, if it's an account that we administered, it'd be Advanta IRA for benefit of Joe Smith, account number 123. That's the basic wording you need to use for the member on the operating agreement. Again, remember the operating agreement is the only place that the full vesting of the member really needs to show up. Everything else really is just going to revolve around the manager acting in the interest of the LLC, filing things like articles, opening up bank accounts. You don't need to take your operating agreement into the bank to open up the bank account. Typically, that's going to do nothing but confuse them if they see the IRA listed on it. But from there, once the account is open, you can have all those things kind of set up. You're going to need to open up that bank account. One thing I will mention is that the biggest issue I see people have when they go to open up an IRA-owned checkbook control LLC bank account, I know that's a mouthful, basically the bank account for the LLC, is they'll go in and they'll walk into the local bank branch and say, hey, I need to open up an IRA LLC bank account. They're not going to know what the heck you're talking about. The only thing you need to do to go open up a bank account for the business is go in there with your articles, your tax ID application, and your driver's license, and then they can basically verify all the information and open up the business checking account for you. Ask for wire instructions, provide that to your IRA custodian along with a copy of the operating agreement and any forms that they need you to complete, and the funds can be wired directly into that LLC's bank account. So from start to finish, you open up the account, you have the operating agreement drafted, you file the articles, you get your tax ID, open up the bank account for the LLC, direct the custodian to fund it, and those 6 easy steps, you're pretty much done. And then once the LLC is funded, then you can go out into the world and do any of the investments. So whether you want to invest in cryptocurrency and use cold storage, you want to invest in, let's say, a rehab project that needs a lot of checks written, or maybe you're just someone that likes to have that tighter control and doesn't want to deal with other people when it comes to investing your money, checkbook control can be a really great way to achieve almost all of those things relatively easily. But keep in mind, it is not all going to be benefits. There are some cons. You need to make sure you take into account the lack of oversight from the custodian. Make sure you understand the rules of self-directed IRAs very well. But so long as you can understand the rules and you're relatively competent with maintaining good records, you'll probably be fine when it comes to doing checkbook control. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for joining us for another edition of the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. My name is Alex Perny, and thanks for joining.
Thank you for tuning in to the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Tune in next week for more investing tips and strategies.
Want to hear more episodes of the Alternative Investing Advantage? Search podcast at advantaira.com and subscribe.